Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be. I'm Ax Zahir, Dean of the Fellows of the SMS, and together with Jeff Royer, who's Deputy Dean of the Fellows, I'm delighted to introduce the first of our Conversations with the Fellows series. In this series, which we hope will become a regular one, we aim to highlight, to showcase SMS Fellows, and occasionally external eminent speakers as well, to discuss some of the pressing issues that we face in the field, and in a broader sense, that business faces. And today we're going to talk about how to bridge strategy and practice, and how to bridge the gulf which exists between practitioners and scholars. So before I pass it on to Jeff to introduce our panelists and the topic, let me give you a set of ground rules which Anna Allen of the SMS has kindly provided. So as per usual practice, all participants are muted and their cameras are off. During the Q&A portion of the session, we will be using Zoom's Q&A tool, and you can find that at the bottom of your screen. Please submit all your questions for the speakers today using this Q&A feature. Our panelists may not be able to get to all the questions, but Jeff will be monitoring the questions as they come in and will direct them to the panelists as appropriate. The chat function is on for this session, so please feel free to use it, although we will not be monitoring it. And finally, the session is being recorded, and the recording will be available in a few days on the SMS website. Over to you, Jeff.
Okay. Thanks, Ax. I'll share my screen here. So many of you might have heard or know that Michael Leiblein and I launched a new journal called the Strategic Management Review. So this is an essay-based outlet that complements others in strategy and is intended to really highlight some of the distinctive contributions of strategic management. So we were lucky to be able to do a series of launch conferences before COVID hit. And actually, we're planning new ones for 2022, one at INSEAD on ecosystems, another on public policy and strategy at Georgetown. And we just came out with our second volume. So this one features a really great article by Marvin Lieberman on whether the concept of competitive strategy actually is sustainable. And frankly, this will change the way that you teach strategy. There's a nice critique of the dynamic capabilities perspective by Collis and Anand. And maybe one other thing to quickly highlight is there's a great debate between Teese and Buckley on the fundamental issues in strategy. So we've got a really deep pipeline of forthcoming work by great people, and would just welcome you to get involved if that's of interest. So one of the things that we're doing that's new is we're publishing from time to time articles that we're calling Perspectives from Practice. So these are essays written by practitioners, often in collaboration or dialogue with academics. And the goal of them is to learn from practice. In other words, to flag high priority research questions that deserve scholarly attention in the field, going forward. So for instance, we have an essay by the CEO of Morgan Stanley, one coming out by Andy Van de Ven, another by Gary Hamel, and one by our keynote speaker today, Martin Reeves. And this is linked to some of his thoughts today in his talk. So Martin Reeves is the chair of BCG's Henderson Institute. He's also the author of a recent book called The Imagination Machine. So Martin's really thought deeply about some of the institutional divides between academe and strategy practice. And I think he has a number of really innovative and constructive ideas on new pathways forward. And he's deeply committed to translational research. So Martin's going to offer a keynote address to us today, and then that will be followed by talks by Africa Arino and Harbir Singh. They'll engage Martin with some questions as well. And I just ask you, if you're interested, please post questions again to the Q&A function as we go, and we'll try to cover as many of those as possible. So I'll turn it over to you, Martin, and we look forward to some of your ideas and thoughts.
Thanks very much, Jeff and Axe. Let me share my screen here. So it's an honor to be addressing the fellows of the SMS today on a very important topic, I think, which is minding the gap between theory and practice. And so I'm going to give you some personal perspectives on this, and it's not so much in the spirit of a practitioner critiquing academia. It's more from the perspective that I think anyone in the strategy business is in the business of translation. We're all in the business of developing ideas and disseminating ideas, whether we're a CSO or a consultant or an academic. We have to think about effective translation. A mentor of mine once reminded me, when I felt very satisfied about a paper that I'd written that other people found obscure, that essentially I'd failed, because in his words, I should always bear in mind that impact is insight times penetration. So we're really talking about the penetration aspect today. Now, the good news is that I think there's actually never been a better time for the business of ideas in business. We have new phenomena, a new context, new unanswered questions, and our ultimate audience, managers, are voracious consumers of theory on a whole set of new topics, whether it's the acceleration of technology and how that changes organizational strategy, whether it's the changing dynamics of strategy because of the speed of digital competition and the accelerated fade rate of competitive advantage, whether it's geopolitical shifts and the impact of politics and society on strategy, or whether it is strategies of collective action against our collective challenges like species depletion and global climate change, which of course affect the context for the whole game. So really, we have our audience is listening. The question is, can we deliver against their needs? Now, I'll just spend a few minutes on the gap. I do so because I think it's interesting to try to understand the nature of the gap, and I have heard some sentiments that the gap between theory and practice is exaggerated, but I don't think it is. So here's a little straw poll I did of academics and practitioners at the Hyderabad SMS meeting, and you can see the red percentages are the percentage disagreeing with the statement. So you can see that in the perception of mainly an academic audience, the fundamental applied mission of strategy is not necessarily fulfilled. 40% of people disagreeing with that comment. An alarming 63% of academics in the room thought that what they were working on was not necessarily practitioner relevant or grounded in real world phenomena or problems. The biggest percentage here is concerns issues of communication. So 81% think that theory doesn't communicate very well with practice, and 76% that there is insufficient interchange. And that's true because, of course, the SMS for some time has had a policy of ABCs, appealing to a practitioner as well as a theoretician audience. But we don't get so many high-ranking practitioners to SMS meetings. So we certainly have a gap, and we should certainly care about that gap. Now, I'm not just going to dwell on the problems today. I'm going to come on very quickly to some solutions, or at least my own humble attempt at suggesting some solutions. If we go right back to the topics that we're working on, I think that's one of the roots of the problem. You can see here the estimated percentage of that SMS audience that saw the relevance of the topics that they were working on to practitioners. So some estimated, the largest percentage, 45%, estimated that only about a quarter of what was being worked on was actually practitioner relevant, and the optimists thought that maybe 50% was. And there was much discussion in a breakout group about the whole problem of how themes are set and the implicit incentives for that, and how that linkage is broken. So this is certainly a dimension of the gap, I think. Now, what I'm not saying is that theoreticians should distribute their theories to practitioners only. I think the information flow is actually two-way. And that is because it links back to the first slide I showed you, showing that there's a tremendous demand for new ideas in management. There's tremendous demand because there are tremendous unexplained phenomena. And that has another consequence, which is that the most interesting questions are questions of practice. And therefore, I think it's no surprise that the audience that I surveyed thought that, while in the past only about a third of ideas and breakthrough insights came from practice, now that perception is that 50% of ideas come from practice. And this makes sense to me in the context of my consulting work. I see that in many leading edge areas like ecosystem strategy, or like leading under social polarization, or the end state of the new dynamics of globalization. On these sorts of questions, practice is well in advance in these fast-moving fields of academia and theory. So therefore, it's in theoreticians' interest, I think, to really get out into the field and get their hands onto data and look at newly emerging phenomena. So the gap, I think, is a two-way communication flow problem, not just a distribution problem. So fundamentally, this leads us, I think, to ask the question, is management innovation, is management science really the applied discipline that it purports to be? So what are the qualifications of an applied discipline like medicine and engineering? I would suggest that they are the ability to integrate theory and practice, the ability to test ideas in the real world, the ability to operationalize and scale new insights, and constant cross-fertilization between theory and practice. And I think if you look at a field like medicine or engineering, they have very well-honed, vibrant mechanisms for achieving these four fundamental tasks. And I think in management innovation, it's not that we don't have anything, but I think the mechanisms are considerably more feeble. So in terms of integrating theory and practice, I think we have business schools where practitioners and academics mix, but I think by their own account, that process could be better. In terms of testing ideas in the real world, we do have these sort of very statistical papers that test for statistical significance, often a very narrow phenomena and not necessarily new or important phenomena. But in some ways, that might be part of the problem, the particular way that the evidence-based analysis is conducted that limits its relevance and accessibility. We do have academics consulting and collaborations between consultants and academics, but the level of interchange, looking at the survey data again, is probably insufficient. So if we conceptualize this a little bit, I think we can think about an applied discipline essentially as a learning loop between theory and practice. And if we start in the top left-hand corner, we surface needs by looking at practice. We serve the needs of practitioners when we set the research themes. And here, some of the blockages might be the inertia of the research agenda, my own limited analysis of how fast the themes in that academia concerns itself with in business management, how fast that changes suggests that there's a very high inertia of the research agenda. the new phenomena catch on, but catch on relatively slowly. And then we develop those ideas about how to explain new phenomena. And I think one of the dangers here is to regard innovation as an end in itself. So when we're talking about a potentially valuable new theory, presumably the audience for that should be those who ultimately we hope to find the theory useful. So I think under ideal circumstances, an annual SMS meeting should be crowded with many practitioners that are hungry for the new theories, which help them with their new phenomenon. But instead, I think the easier game is playing to the gallery. It is management innovation as an end in itself. Management innovation for the eyes of other management innovators. So you lack that real world discipline and selection mechanism, and perhaps an overemphasis on quantification. I'm not sure how you find some of these very statistical papers in the Strategic Management Journal. I find them personally very heavy going. I'm very interested in new management theory. I try to read as much as I can, and I find the very statistical, dense papers about very narrow phenomena rather hard to read. I can't read so many of them, and I think we have a communication format problem that prevents even the best work from being disseminated. I think there's this false equation of formality with rigor. My own experience of public intellectuals is that the most brilliant minds can speak plain English. They can take complicated or unfamiliar or counterintuitive ideas and explain them very well. And whether it be the papers or the communication protocols at academic conferences, I think we can do a lot of work on communication. I think the reason, going back to that mentor story, that my mentor reminded me that impact was insight times penetration, is that he thought that I didn't communicate particularly well. And at the time, that seemed to me to be a rather trivial point. I saw myself as being much more interested in the content, in the insights, but I've come to appreciate that actually you should give equal emphasis to the communication. And then in terms of the testing of ideas and the feedback, we really need much more interchange of ideas and people between academia and practice in order to not only disseminate, but in order to have the new ideas tested, and in order to have a feedback loop so that we can complete the cycle. And all of this, of course, is informed by a bunch of contextual factors like what are the incentives when the theme of the PhD student is chosen? Are they even trying to or consciously considering relevance to practice, or are they more considering other factors like the alignment with the mentor's theme, or the alignment with the prevailing thinking? Forums. I think it's quite hard to get a forum together whereby theoreticians can be very rigorous and practitioners can be very practical and they can talk to each other. That's a hard thing to do. But I think it's other disciplines, I think, manage to achieve it. I'm thinking of medical conferences, for example. And so I think one can do much more with the forums. And I've already addressed the language gap. So coming to the underlying notion, and I did at the Prague SMS meeting some years ago, hear somebody stand up and defend the idea that there was a trade-off between rigor and relevance, and that having too many practitioners in the academic meeting would somehow undermine the rigor of the meeting. I've heard that view defended, and so let me address that. I believe that there is no necessary trade-off between rigor and relevance and accessibility. I think we can work on relevant things. I think we can be very rigorous, and I think we should be capable of communicating the results in an appealing and an understanding fashion. And I think there's a whole bunch of things that we can do to help us to break the false trade-off. We can get into the world. We can go and discuss what the latest problems and phenomena and questions are. We can be very phenomenon driven. We can say, let's work on the most important problems in practice right now. We can shift the incentives. We can, when we set the PhD themes or the research themes, we can ask ourselves, how relevant is this to practitioners? We can make sure that our ideas are tested or at least discussed by a broad audience. And I think there's such a thing as a disciplined narrative. A statistical model is a way of quantitatively testing a relatively narrow set of phenomena. I think most business problems are dynamic, ambiguous, multi-factor, shifting, and I think a narrative doesn't just mean making up a story. We can have disciplined narratives which are consistent, precise, challenged, coherent, and we may need to remaster the narrative art in order to communicate about the complex problems of business. I think accessibility is about communicating at all levels. I take the tweet as seriously as the Nature paper. I like to communicate on all length scales for different audiences. I think we can always say, would my mother understand this? Would the person on the street understand this? I think we can always make sure we're speaking plain and clear English. I think we can create trading zones. I think one of those speakers may have something to say about this today, which means formats which are deliberately designed so that people from different backgrounds can communicate together. And we can take seriously the marketing problem. I would hope that we wouldn't make the mistake that I made some years ago, which is to treat the marketing problem as a sort of an afterthought or a relatively trivial dimension of the business of disseminating and developing ideas. I think the penetration and the appeal of the ideas is definitely an important part of the problem. When we asked the audience in Hyderabad what were the most important potential solutions, I guess two sets of things came up. One of them was the targeting of the themes themselves, and the other one is the exchange of ideas and people. And I would tend to agree with that, because if we make a realistic assumption that we probably can't simultaneously re-engineer and manage all aspects of the problem that I've laid out, we can at least establish a context within which solutions are likely to emerge. And I think the most important aspect of that context is probably to have people from different audiences at least speaking to each other about ideas of common interest. Because if that happens, then you have mutual critique. You indirectly get to some notion of what is relevant and appealing. You put in place a selection mechanism. You potentially set up the basis for the exchange of people. So I think if there's one most important factor to get right, it's the forums and the protocol for exchanging ideas and people. So lastly, you've asked me to share some particular practices that I employ to try to bridge the gap in my business, and so I'm sure I don't have the whole solution here, but for what it's worth, here are my efforts on this topic. So I run something called the Henderson Institute, which is BCG's think tank for developing new ideas and frameworks in business that we believe our clients will need in the future. So we're looking 5 years out at what will be important and trying to preemptively develop the frameworks for that. And that involves so that mission is very much grounded in the business leader being the ultimate customer, but it also bridges into academia, where we source the ideas. So I'm very much in the business of translation, and painfully aware that that translation problem is one that requires constant attention. So where do the ideas that we work on come from? Probably two places. We essentially are we see ourselves as a marketplace or a translational mechanism between new phenomena in the business world, or anomalies in the business world, or emerging questions in the business world. So we do a lot of listening. I do a lot of scanning of lead lists and new project lists to see what are those phenomena, to try to keep current with the ultimate needs, the emerging needs of the customer base. And that's subtle, of course, because people are not necessarily consistent in their language or self-aware of their emerging needs. They might describe it in terms of something that doesn't work, or some new and emerging phenomenon. And so we look to business for those anomalies that are the triggers for our research. And then we look beyond business academia for emerging theories and other disciplines that can potentially address some of those phenomena, be it sociology or technology or economics and politics. So I think the point I'm making here is we try to ground everything in emerging phenomena or emerging questions. Our current portfolio essentially isn't so much focused on the trends, the change drivers in business, things like the acceleration of technology and AI and the dynamics of globalization, as the implications of those for strategy and organization. And we think very much in terms of the strategy stack. In other words, not just strategy narrowly defined, but strategy, organization, technology, people, because personally, I haven't seen a problem in business in years that didn't involve all of those elements. They're all interrelated and they're all in flux. So we think about the strategy stack rather than strategy narrowly defined. And you can see that, I won't read them out, but you can see the themes here that we're working on, which are our attempt to appeal to and develop useful theories around, and useful interventions around these emerging themes. So broadly at the level of strategy, it's all about dynamics, competing on learning, resilience, vitality, ambidexterity, essentially practical dynamic strategy. At the level of organization, it's about the new unit of analysis of the multi-company business ecosystem, and what does strategy mean for a business ecosystem. It's about reconceptualizing organization as a synergistic hybrid between machine cognition and human cognition, and trying to develop the blueprint for that organization. It's about a more rigorous, evidence-based, real-time approach to change management, which is probably one of the most important but flimsy theories we have in business, change management. So we're trying to just work on evidence-based management, change management there. Under people, I just wrote a book on the creative side of strategy, harnessing human imagination, and we're interested in cognitive diversity, how that affects team performance and the like. And then we're interested in these broader social questions of leading under social polarization, how to solve collective action problems like climate change, sustainable business model innovation, and the like. So you may disagree or have a different opinion about whether these are the most relevant themes, but this is our attempt to be relevant and useful to the emerging needs of business. So some particular measures that we adopt to break this false trade-off between relevance and rigor and reach. So on the relevance dimension, we try to codify success. So success in this translational sense is when we are told by practitioners that we're relevant to their emerging problems, where we are told that we have a unique and a useful perspective, where we see our ideas being translated into practice. And I think that this is something that not only needs to happen, it's something which needs to be codified, because while failure is often failure to do that is often for often driven by a small number of factors like ineffective communication, I think success requires multiple factors to go right. And so when occasionally we do get this right, we actually spend some time reflecting, why did it go right? And how do we codify that and use that to inform our future translational research efforts? We try to employ a principle of what we call laboratory of the client, which is we make sure that in some way, shape or form, clients have a foot in every project. So they might be co-investors in the project, we might be co-publishing with them, they might be on a sounding board, we might ask them to critique emerging ideas early, but we do nothing in isolation, because it's very easy to fall in love with an idea that ultimately isn't relevant because you're not listening to your audience. We have a very systematic lead and project radar, so I'm constantly scanning the lead lists in BCG for projects that stand out and might be harbingers of the future. So when a Chinese electronics company asks us for help in developing a governance model that will have longevity in an industry that has relatively short life cycles, that's interesting. That's not a regular everyday need, and so we try to mobilize around and invest behind those emerging problems. In a sense, we're also looking for what, if you'll excuse the technical jargon, what you might call important BS. In other words, there are some themes in business which are not that novel. They may be very old. They may be old chestnuts, like, for instance, change management, but whose underpinnings are relatively flimsy. So we know that 75% of major change efforts fail. So that is, in a sense, in our sweet spot of not an emerging theme, but a perennial theme that we need to have more theoretical and interventional reliability behind. So it's a relevance based on effectiveness, not of novelty. In terms of rigor, we try to spend time in both academia and client environments, bridging science and business, and where the science is well beyond management science. And also we try to employ this rigorous narrative technique of asking, not how can we statistically model this, we sometimes do that, but asking what is going on here and looking for a rigorous narrative explanation as to what is going on and what one can do about it by using the 3 C's of consistency, coherence, and challenge. In terms of reach, we take seriously all length scales of publication. So whenever we have an idea, we try to tweet about it, we try to do LinkedIn posts, we try to write about it in practitioner journals, we try to write it into practitioner-oriented slide decks, and occasionally if something is truly novel rather than just translationally novel, we may go for a full-strength academic publication like Nature. In fact, a couple of years ago, for the fun of it, we got together with the London Institute of Mathematical Sciences and decided to see whether it was possible to have a paper in Nature and Harvard Business Review at the same time on the same topic, and completely break this trade-off between relevance, rigor, and reach. In fact, we narrowly failed just because the academic publishing timelines were quite slow. But within the same year, we had a paper in Science and in Sloan Management Review on the same topic, the harnessing the math of serendipity, and it taught us a lot, I think, about what you need to do to break this false equation between relevance and rigor, even though it was quite a painful process. We measure engagement. We measure the reach of the ideas. Is anyone reading it? We measure the time spent. We measure the seniority of the stakeholders reading the papers, and we look at the impact of those papers on access to those senior stakeholders, progression of the conversation and the topic agenda. So we try to take the reach variables as seriously as the content variables. So I think my time is up. Let me pause there and hand back to Jeff.
So Africa, would you like to present?
Thank you. And good day to all. And thank you, Apps. Thank you, Jeff, for creating the opportunity for this conversation. Thank you, Anna, as well, for being here to make it possible. I would like to first react a little bit to Martin's comments, and then I also want to share with you some of the actions that we at the SMS board are taking to promote this closer connection between strategic management, scholarship, and practice. So, going to the cycle that Martin was talking about, clearly we need to interact more closely to surface the needs of practice. And in looking at the emerging management themes that Martin shared with us, something that I see in my thinking is in common to all of these themes is that they are important issues, but not urgent, and that they are forward-looking. Now, this is important to take into account when selecting our research questions. If we tackle important but not urgent things and strategy questions meet those requirements, we can actually reconcile the time pressures that practitioners have with a different type of time pressure, a different time horizon that we as scholars have. We also, he touched upon the need to collaborate and engage in dialogue to develop new ideas. And thought, well, we are somehow a two-sided market where practitioners have data and we have analytical skills and hopefully the capacity to draw insights from that analysis. And by the way, when I say data, I do not mean only quantitative data. Qualitative data is also data, and it's very relevant for gaining insights. So to develop new ideas, we can leverage those complementary resources and skills that we have. But for the two sides of the market to meet, I think that we scholars need to make an effort to build trust and to build confidence that what we have to offer to practice is valuable. And this comes to the next point about communication and translation. In fact, good research has the potential to be impactful. I would like to refer you back to an article that Julian Birkenshaw and a couple of colleagues of him published back in 2016 at the Academy of Management, Learning and Education, that looked at what type of academic research gets translated in the so-called bridge journals, such as Sloan Management Review, California Management Review, Harvard Business Review, and so on. And one of the features that they found is that actually that is good research that gets highly cited by other academics. So if we want to have that impact, we need to engage more deeply with the potential relevance of our findings. And communicating that effectively, of course, it involves avoiding academic jargon, but it goes beyond that. Managers are interested in getting the big picture, in putting findings in the broader context. And we need to do that when we communicate to managers. We need to not just show very narrow results from a very specific research question, but put that in the context of what we know about the phenomenon and how our findings actually relate to other findings in that literature. In fact, other features of those academic articles that get referenced in rich journals are that they tackle broad, important topics that are ranked or rated as interesting by practitioners, and also that they are more likely to be inductive or theoretical rather than deductive. So let me turn to the actions that we at the SMS board are undertaking to strengthen the connection between strategy, practice, and scholarship. As you know, our mission is to bring together the worlds of reflective practice and thoughtful scholarship. And the board has the will to reinvigorate that mission, our mission. This is why in recent years we have appointed George Stott and this year, George from BCG, and Paul Mang, who has a very interesting background. He started as an tenure-track academic, then he turned into consultancy, and now he's a business executive, so he has the ABC background, very rare. We have appointed them to our board because we want to bring the perspective of practice into the board. And so our new executive director, Barbara Grobitsky, she brings, who is also a board member, she brings that perspective because she was working before for the American Marketing Association, which is an association where marketing scholars and practitioners come together. So she comes with great ideas to promote our mission. Specific actions that we are taking. One is we are creating what Martin calls a trading zone, where academics and practitioners, consultants and business people will meet to discuss. In particular, it should have happened in 2020. We will hopefully hold in 2022 a special conference in Milan in collaboration with Bocconi. The theme is Governing Knowledge and Imagination in the Digital Era. And this conference will have some very innovative session types. We will have some labs, some social media interaction, and in these sessions practitioners will be invited to pose questions to session participants and then work with them to develop solutions. So we really hope ABCs to engage in a common conversation around issues brought by practitioners. There will also be a subtrack for practitioner research submissions in every research presentation track. Another action is that we will soon launch what will be called a Responsible Research in Business and Management Award, RRBM Award. This award is inspired by and in support of the RRBM initiative, which is a grassroots movement that aims at encouraging and supporting research that is credible and useful. The change that this grassroots initiative aims at bringing requires collective action from multiple stakeholders, from deans, journal editors, association leaders, senior scholars, business executives, accreditation leaders, and so on. So this award will recognize a conference paper that best meets the goals of RRBM in the sense that it's a paper that offers useful and credible knowledge in the field of strategic management, with an emphasis on papers with a substantial involvement of stakeholders of those kinds. So managers, consultants, in addition to academic scholars. And by substantial involvement, we mean that they are either involved as co-authors or that they have an active involvement in providing data or analyzing it, or even co-developing and implementing practices. More briefly, because I don't want to run over time, we launched in 2020 the Strategy Imagination Forum, a series of webinars to share cutting-edge thinking on current strategy, led by ABC strategy thinkers. And the second season will start in October after our annual conference. And you also know about the Research in Organizations program of the SRF that grants funds for research that addresses a problem that's of interest both to practice and to scholarship, and with the requisite that the study be conducted in an organization and that scholars collaborate with managers. Of course, quality of the proposal is a prerequisite. And as a next step, we want to take actions to promote that translation and that fractal communication. To that end, we have expanded the role of the publications manager to be the publications and content strategy manager, with the goal to create new ways to disseminate and make accessible the knowledge that the SMS membership creates. And we have hired a new person that started last week, Ryan Free. Well, we hope that these and other actions will help strengthen the connection between strategic management, scholarship, and practice. Thank you, and I'll pass it on to Jeff again.
Yeah, so I'll just invite Harbir to offer his remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm just delighted to join this group. I want to thank Jeff and Axe for organizing, and Martin for a very, very stimulating presentation. My remarks consist of 4 main points, and I just wanted to quickly react to what Martin was talking about. The first one is really about relevance versus rigor, and I think that has been an ongoing theme in the strategy field. And I suppose the positive end of that is that there has always been a commitment to relevance. And I think you might have people taking different positions, but the commitment to relevance has taken us this far, including a seminar such as this. I think, as you said, Martin, that this is a way to sort of provoke and challenge and stimulate discussion. There is actually plenty of work that matches the test of relevance and rigor. Part of the question of relevance is relevance to whom? And we have multiple audiences there. But also, and rigor is really a question, I think you brought up the idea of coherence and consistency. I think the other 2 things I will add on rigor is cumulative work and replicable work. And I think some of the sort of the more esoteric kind of work that we talk about really is trying to pursue the idea of cumulative research. And I think that's something to think about as well, because sometimes the front end exploratory work is obviously to generate new theories, and I'm going to come to that. The second point I wanted to make was much like what Africa was talking about, and I think what you also mentioned, that there are institutional opportunities here that might help people address this question of bridging the gap. And one of the examples I would like to bring to the table is the idea of centers in universities or business schools that are committed to providing research-based insight to decision makers. And I've been involved in one such center for a long time, which is now large enough that it's called an institute. It's the Mac Institute for Innovation. And in that, we have a group of about 25 companies that are partners to the Institute. We also we fund about 40 research projects per year, and there are about 50 or so working papers a year on various subjects related to evolution of industries, new ideas on new business models. What you mentioned, Martin, the idea of change management, biases in decision making, and so on. And I think you make a very good point in your talk, which I want to emphasize. Very good point from my point of view. And I think Africa also mentioned that. And that's the idea of trading zones. And I would call this a trading zone, which is where interested practitioners are involved in research streams that people are bringing. But it is I think the key element I found there was a loosely coupled relationship. So you're talking about the insights that relate to practice, and of course people from practice talking about questions that they have in a particular domain. So that's one such idea. Africa did a very, very nice job talking about the various things the SMS is doing. And I think the interest groups in particular, as somebody who's on the receiving end of that, I find that there's a lot of very, very committed work to try to bring people closer to phenomena and give them opportunities to do that. So in the area of institutional, I guess the bucket there is institutional interventions. And I think we talked about translational research, but I think the notion of committed conversations that bridge the gap is really what I'm talking about. And just to give you a couple of outputs from that work, one is a book that recently Nikolai Sigelkov, my colleague in the management department, and Christian Terwish, an operations professor, wrote called Connected Strategy. And that was really about strategy in the digital world, but looking at some new ideas on how to think about strategizing under different conditions. And also thinking about new phenomena there, which is in engaging with customers and how firms are actually changing their structures dramatically. Another sort of piece of work in that area, just to illustrate, was on technology acquisitions and how, in fact, acquisitions in the technology space, it turns out integration is very often necessary to get value, even though one would shrink from integration. And that was based on fieldwork in Silicon Valley, followed by a survey and then statistical research and so on. So I think there are ways to sort of and have different outputs in different places is the other thing you talked about as well. You talked about a learning cycle. My third point is really, you wanted to talk about a learning cycle. It might be interesting to think about a research cycle. And the research cycle, I would offer sort of a commitment to interesting and unusual phenomena as one of the starting points. But I would also say new theoretical lenses is another starting point. And a third starting point is new ways to infer results. And I think to your concern about statistics, I would say one has to pay attention to whether people came up with a sufficient statistic to what they were doing. And I think that can actually go quite far. So just to speak more about that, I think what you're calling for is more inductive field-based research, which I strongly agree with. And that would actually generate testable propositions as output. And I think some journal outputs on that would be also very, very important. And the fourth point I'll make is at the individual level, that, many of the people in the audience are professors. And I think there's a lot we can learn working with alumni as a way to thinking about what are some of the practitioner challenges that they face. I have actually brought in alumni for live case studies to the classroom. And so I found that very productive. Many universities and schools are doing lifelong learning, and that's another opportunity. So we should not just think about field-based research as taking a question, finding a respondent, going to the field. It's also being very exploratory. And I think you were talking about that. I would just end with one last point. I think you brought up the idea of medical research, was very interesting. And if you think about the new vaccine that came up and the debate, it was very interesting. The debate was really about research design and about generalizability of results. But it also was about integration of mRNA with other modes of, other pieces of the inputs to these vaccines. And a lot of that was very esoteric. So I think you're really talking about integration of different points of view. So I guess to conclude, I will say relevance and rigor, talk about translational research and institutional arrangements, talk about the research cycle, and talk about really thinking about replicability of our work. Thank you very much.
We have a few questions, but maybe I'll give Harbir or Africa the first crack at this. If you might have any questions that you'd like to pose to Martin to get us going. Africa, do you have a question or two?
Yes, going back to the learning cycle that you shared with us, the last phase about testing and implementation of ideas, I see this is where we scholars may have more difficulty in entering and contributing directly. On the one hand, you talked about the fast pace of how needs shift. On the other hand, about our own inertia to tackle new issues. And I was wondering, how do you think, whether and how do you think that academics and consultants might collaborate fruitfully in that phase of testing and implementing, or more broadly?
Well, I think it's about a number of things. I think it's about being flexible and pragmatic about how we think about testing, because so there is, there's rigorous testing of replicable phenomena and under controlled circumstances. Rarely possible with, sometimes possible with operational problems because you have a repeated problem with similar parameters. Rarely possible for strategy problems. But I think one can, one could think about different standards of testing. Adoption of an idea, outcomes, case studies, narratives, outcome statistics, full statistical studies. I think there's some innovation to be had around the means of testing. But I think the most basic aspect would be to create forums where different types of minds come together to discuss the new ideas and their adoption and what happened, the sort of before and after discussions. And so that, I think, is about appealing to our ultimate customers and managers about the relevance of our contributions, both consultants and academics. So I do some of that. I mean, we have academic collaborators, and we do take them into client situations, and we do have those discussions. It's not easy though, because you have to form a common language, you have to form bonds of trust, but it's certainly possible.
Thank you.
So I had Jeff, in response to your request, Martin. I think it will be one of the interesting ways of thinking about this is the thought leadership that is done by Henderson Institute, for example, and sort of connecting that with what's done in academic conferences. So thinking pragmatically, having a large session or a track where we look at some insights on a broad set of questions that have been thought about by people with much more access to practitioners, with really sort of qualitative and rich data, and faculty who may have had perhaps a more larger sample exploration of a similar thing, and have a dialogue around that. I think that will go a long way. What we learned, and I'm only giving an example that I have, but I've seen other research centers, is the loose coupling but engaged dialogue. I think that's a very useful metaphor. And I was wondering whether I'm right about that or not.
Yeah, this reminds me of the problem of the penetration of value-based healthcare. So we have this problem that healthcare systems are based more on individual institutional incentives or the cost of the inputs as opposed to the value created. And a colleague of mine has done some work on what does it take for a new idea to be operationalized by a heterogeneous system. And I think the most basic thing is repeated dialogue and transparency and a set of common output metrics. Some sort of taxonomy of situations or problems, some sort of measure of output and some ability to have repeated discussion on it. I think those to me are some of the basic requirements. So it sounds easy, but of course there's a lot of art in putting together those forums, because I think the fact is, if a practitioner does go to an academic strategy meeting, certainly there's a lot that they can get out of it, but they're a little bit at a disadvantage in that forum. We need to create a more sort of a more equal forum where their views are valued. The communication protocols are not slanted towards things that may be unfamiliar to them. But I think it's certainly possible. Now, I guess the other sort of comment I'd make is sort of leveling up, which is, of course, we're talking about an average phenomenon today, but of course in practice there's a huge dispersion. You have academics that are in great demand with CEOs and whose interventions are acted upon and which create impact, and so perhaps some case studies, some codification work for what is it that those people do beyond popular publishing. What are the subtle things that they do to be relevant and in demand, and just to see whether they can be made more broadly applicable. And some of that might involve training. It's a trivial thing, but I noticed at a couple of SMS meetings, if you'll excuse me for saying so, just how far from the industry standard the professionalism of the communications was. Well, that's a very trainable thing, right? You could say, well, that's a serious thing. If we have the right ideas, they're not going to travel unless they're well communicated. Put all PhD students through a communications course or something. It's probably some very simple stuff too.
So maybe a couple questions from the participants, then we'll come back to Africa and Herbir. So one question is by Jay Barney, and he notes that obviously there's value created via division of labor. So the general question then would be, how can we get gains from this type of collaboration without losing the value from a division of labor? And we also have another question from a PhD student, Sandy Bisui, and his question could be kind of framed in the same light, where he's asking, like, well, Martin, if you went back and decided to do a PhD in strategy and focus your life as an academic, how would you kind of put to work some of your ideas and not get kind of swamped by concerns for say statistical identification for its own sake? So again, Jay's question maybe has a number of other dimensions to it. But
so I think on Jay's question, I think I think we have enough division. I think division of labor is a good thing. We all have different specialties, and I think maybe we could do something to further clarify who does what or something. I don't know, but I think we have plenty of division. What we don't have is the ability to easily speak to each other, in terms of the formats and the language and the mutual relevance and the mutual appeal. I would tend to work on that side of things. So concretely, I think let's experiment with new forums where we bring practitioners and translators and theoreticians together and see what works. And I'd probably do it in the context of the particular, and I'd probably do it multiply so that one can experiment and have some sort of selective mechanism, because it's not such a trivial thing. So for example, take the most important and new topic in strategy. Let's say it's digital ecosystem strategy or something like that, and then frame an initiative around that and have one of the requirements of the discipline that it's only going to commission research which practitioners validate as relevant, and it's going to involve a lot of practitioner interchange, and it has a set of desired outcomes, and it's signed up to. You don't press the go button until you have a critical mass of both theoretical minds and practitioner minds, and frame a very narrow initiative on something, get something right, and then see if one can spread the lessons.
Just as a friendly amendment to that, actually, I was exactly on a similar path, keeping something a narrow theme, and certainly ecosystems is a great theme, digital ecosystems. I think to your other point, Martin, which I think is one that needs addressing, is the idea that at many of our conferences, the numbers are so asymmetric that it's very difficult to have a dialogue. So one might need to think about a sort of some curation of the group that might be involved in terms of even discussion, just so that there is enough free interchange and they're not language barriers, in a sense, terminology barriers.
We take note of that, Herbert. Thank you.
I think there's an interesting question about how can practitioners be motivated to collaborate? As Clay Christensen said, I think practitioners are voracious consumers of theory. They're very pragmatic. You know, what works, and they constantly have a stream of new problems. So I think it's essentially a simple marketing problem, which is you need to be have something relevant to say. You need to know, therefore, what is relevant to the other person. You need to be current with their concerns. You need to have some sort of relationship building activity. You know, rarely can you turn the relationship on logically when you need it. It has to be, you know, preemptive. I think you have to communicate well. I think practitioners may be voracious consumers of theory, but they are completely intolerant of obscurity. You know, we spend a lot of time sort of working the arguments so that they're digestible, so that the complex becomes simple. As I think recently Satya Nadella said that, you know, sort of what do managers do? They make complex things simple. Unfortunately, they often get confused and it becomes the other way around. It's, you know, if we bear in mind that we have a responsibility for communicating our ideas really well and we work that side of things, I think we do these things. I mean, I think the telephone will be ringing off the hook. I think practitioners need advice on these new questions.
One question that might be for African Harbir comes from Swapan Ghosh, and he talks about teaching. And obviously that's one of the main ways that we disseminate knowledge. And maybe as a working hypothesis or speculation, you know, the diversity of topics and, you know, research in the SMJ might exceed that of, you know, what appears in our textbooks. And so, you know, when we think about these gaps, you know, maybe a question about how's this handled at IASA or Wharton? How do we think about the connection between practice, research, and what's going on in the, you know, core and elective courses? And is my speculation on target or not?
Well, I think we cannot have as an ambition to encapsulate everything in our classroom. I think that each one of us has a particular expertise in a particular topic, and this is where we can draw very good insights and very good learning points in class and for discussion with our participants in our own areas of expertise. And I think this is where the idea of engaging with the relevance of our findings comes in. It's not just about my little findings in my small and narrow research paper. It's about where does this fit in the overall picture. That's something that speaks to the needs of our audience and create our own frameworks around our field of expertise. I think this is where I would go. It's actually impossible to read all of SNJ. At least
that triggers two thoughts, Africa. One of them is, you know, what we've mainly been discussing today, I think, is, you know, theoretical perspectives on new problems and their communication to practitioners. But I think there's a different way of looking at this, which is people who do that also do something else, which is they make sense of situations. They step into complex situations and they say, what is this an example of? Let me conceptualize what might be going on here. Codification and sense making. I don't think we should neglect that side of things. Because bringing all this theoretical knowledge and using it to make sense of particular situations, I think one can get that sort of dialogue going. And then connected to that, another point that your comment triggers, Africa, is, you know, perhaps dropping the obsession, and I'm guilty of this too, with the paper. The paper is not the end of a journey. The paper is, it's a means to an end, and it's the beginning of a journey. If an idea is communicated, then the idea still needs to do work. And, that's actually more important. It's the beginning of a journey. And there are ways of communicating other than papers. And of course, we have some incentive problems there. Some academics may be highly incented to produce a certain number of papers in a certain number of journals, and that may be most of what they think about. I'm told, but I think we can, just sort of diversifying the focus on obscure academic papers, I think would help it, because I think we're primarily talking here about activities which are not heavy papers.
Fully agree.
What I would add is that as researchers, we may have a separate column around phenomena and around actionable ideas, along with other things. So when you're teaching something or dealing with a particular concept, what is the actionable question? I think, Martin, as you were saying, and then how do you frame the concept in the context of that question that allows you to get a bit closer to the idea?
So there are a couple of questions about kind of these time dynamics, the time differences between practice and research, and a couple of questions following up on Africa. Your notion of the distinguishing the important and the urgent. So for instance, Bala Chakravarti asks, he says, well, what's not urgent today will become urgent a few years from now, and the question then is, what does that mean for the research methods that we're doing? And, there aren't established databases to milk, so he asks, action research is much aligned, but should we revive it? And maybe more broadly, Martin, I know that you scan across, a wide range of disciplines. Are there other research methods that we should be thinking of prioritizing?
Well, I think that there is an intriguing idea. I don't think it's easy. It's prospective case study research. It's somehow, it could be similar to action research, but with lesser involvement from the scholar, in the sense that you understand a situation, and then you can predict, well, different routes and what might happen if this route is taken, and then look at a later point in time what has happened and compare. Of course, this needs to be very, very carefully designed, and understand the reasons why you would expect this to happen and not that to happen, and it requires a very fine, detailed research design. But that might be one way to go.
A couple of thoughts. So I think we're talking about prediction problems here, but I think the value of ideas management is not just about prediction problems. It's about useful ways of looking at things. It's about the ability to shape how we look at things. So I think we should not just be obsessed only with prediction. I think I see this big intersection between the conversations and research, and so some of the conversations that we have to surface new phenomena, to create opportunities to make sense of new phenomena, and to legitimize research agendas and interventions. So one of them is we have a meeting called the Meeting of Minds. The Meeting of Minds is where we get eminent academics across different disciplines, maybe a historian, a complex systems expert, and so on, and some CEOs. We get about 14 or 15 people, and we discuss a big problem of common interest for 2 days. For instance, the last one we did was on optimizing strategy on multiple timescales, and evolution has something to say about that, and history has something to say about that, and system science has something to say about that, and this is one way of finding new ideas and to frame them in a way that is relevant to the practitioners present. We have a dinner that we run sometimes called a Bring Your Own Problem dinner. So not bring your own bottle, but bring your own problem, where we invite CEOs and academics and consultants to a big roundtable dinner, and the CEOs get their piece of paper with their problems on, the things that are on their mind, and the whole table discusses so and so's problem and then so and so's problem, and that can be the beginning of a collaboration and a research agenda. But it's the front end of it, the communications end, which is the building of the relationships, the framing of the phenomenon, the framing of the problem. I think that's in a way more important than the technicalities of the research that I those are my thoughts.
I offer two thoughts. One of them is, and Bala, nice to hear from you. One is around grounded research, and I think that tradition exists, and I think the journals are open to sort of grounded theory, which is inductive research. I think the interesting point there is to think about the goal of hypothesis generation rather than conclusions in every piece of work. And the second point I would make related to that is programmatic research, so that you can accommodate some of these hypothesis generation studies with hypothesis testing studies. Does not necessarily have to be at the individual level. It could be at a departmental level in the school. But I think, Bala, what you're saying, which is important, is that we need to think about multiple outlets. I think, not to put words in Jeff's area, but the strategic management review is a format where you could possibly publish exploratory field-based work, or at least propose that. I think the other idea that may come back into favor is writing monographs, and also thinking about research books. Some of the most impactful work in strategy has been in research books, and many of them are qualitative.
That's very interesting, Harber. That triggers another thought, which is, I had a joke about economics the other day that was quite thought-provoking. It was the idea that an economist calls economically irrational, something that doesn't fit with their simplified model of the world. So I think there's a similar phenomenon, here, in that we have an image of rigorous research methods and papers which discuss them, and reality is messier, and we treat that gap, that messiness, as some sort of departure from theoretical purity. But there's another way of looking at it, which is that the problem solving in the real world has its own ecological rationality. I mean, great managers and great leaders take messy, incomplete problems and can be, more effective than average at adopting new ideas to solve them. So, what is that? What is that ecological? What is that ecological reality? What are those pragmatic methods? If we frame the problem solving in that way, it has a number of appealing characteristics. I think one, it's acknowledging the messiness of the real situations where we want our ideas to be applicable. And two, it's sort of respectful of the practitioner's art. It doesn't start with some standard of academic purity. And thirdly, it helps us eventually have pragmatic interventions that we can use in messy situations. So not making the same mistake as the economist does, labeling irrational or imperfect things that don't fit with our methodology and our analytical protocols.
So
the only problem where the metaphor might break down, just to put a lighthearted spin on it, is most strategists would never say anything's non-strategic. Everything's strategic now. Right? So, how about Africa and Harbir? Do you have a question? We have a couple more from the floor, but anything else you'd like to ask Martin?
I was intrigued. I read your paper at Strategic Management Review, and there is at the end a note where you say, well, maybe one way to enhance collaboration would be to have an open source innovation approach. How do you envision that?
Was that to me, Africa?
Yes.
Well, I think the idea is solve the gap by ignoring the silos, by mixing up the participation. So I'm thinking of any form of interchange, be it on a transactional basis, for solving a particular problem, recruiting a. So one concept I use sometimes in solving problems that are, hard to frame or very, very novel is, I think about a circus of minds. I think about, getting all of the different minds together to solve the problem. You're recruiting minds in a sort of an open source fashion to solve a particular problem, and that is not only flexible to the specific situation. It sort of breaks, effectively breaks down the silos, or put another way, perhaps we can think about a marketplace of ideas to solve this translation problem that we're talking about today. Some sort of two-sided marketplace for problems and theories, and creating teams to solve those theories. Perhaps we can at least do it in a microcosm and see how to make it work, and then perhaps scale it. And it's connected with also the idea of just increasing personnel interchange. I mean, making it easy for academics to spend a year in industry or a year in a consultancy. So certainly one thing that I'm trying to do right now is to set up some sort of mechanism whereby academics can just, or practitioners can just come spend some time with us. And so I've been indulging in a set of conversations to figure out why would somebody want to do that. And it turns out there are all sorts of reasons why people might want to do that. One of them is to just have fresh thoughts in a fresh environment. Another one is to get closer to practice. Another one is to work with a new set of colleagues, no problem. Another one is to give more focus to something than they might otherwise be able to have if they have their teaching load and their administrative load. So it turns out that actually it's a desirable thing. We just don't have the mechanisms in place to be doing a lot of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Martin, can you speak a bit more to the institutional side? You talked about the unblocking the learning cycle, and I think one of them was this idea about partnerships between academia and organizations. What are some of the other things that you can think about institutionally that might unblock the learning cycle a bit more?
Well, I think you could just look at all of the milestones of a career and just look for opportunities to bridge the gap. So, for instance, career paths. I mean, in this applied discipline, in other applied disciplines, I mean, one needs to spend a certain amount of time in practice in order to qualify as an academician in a certain area. So you have the residency requirements of doctors, for example, career paths. You have incentives, and how do you evaluate and reward people? Is it only number of papers in SMJ, or is it number of papers and number of practitioner readers, or is it time spent in industry? Or one could, there are one or two business schools that are that emphasize other things, but it's still probably not the norm. One could think about that. I think bringing the outside in, so going out there, but also bringing the outside in. I think it's a very easy thing to do in business schools, right? To invite practitioners in and to involve practitioners in collaborative projects. I think you've mentioned a couple yourself. I think sort of setting up centers that are focused on particular problems, that as part of their governance have a requirement that it's set up in a balanced manner in the first place, with lots of interchange. I think a lot of it has to do with data, actually. I think a lot of many of the problems I deal with nowadays, I'm sure you two are basically about acquiring unique and important data sets, and that's hard because people don't just hand over their proprietary data so easily. But one can think about structural solutions to get access to data. So, for instance, I know that Alibaba has a research institute, and they often put up data sets and commission research on different questions in relation to those data sets. One can imagine some some initiatives like this where somehow we manufacture better access for academia to current data on current problems, and that would expand the lens too. So I think there are lots of things that that one can do. It's one of those problems where there isn't a great deal of urgency, though. I don't think that your business school will go broke if you don't do that, and without that lack of urgency, these things can be put on the back burner and deprioritized. Which is probably why it makes sense to do these in particular areas, in sort of centers first, and to get it right somewhere. I think one thing that you can do at the level of the SMS is to put a spotlight on the glowing exceptions. So everything we've talked about today, of course, there are many exceptions, and maybe we should. Maybe I know you have your sort of mechanisms like prizes and guest lectures and so on, but recognition and letting glory accrue to these people that solve these translational problems to an even greater degree, I think could be a powerful mechanism. Even where I find that in industry, even where you have incentive problems, you can always do something on recognition. So, for instance, it's quite complicated to play with the incentives in health insurance and so on. But you always have the ego of the doctors, and there's always something that you can do to shift behavior by working on recognition, because everybody has their own professional self-esteem. So maybe that's the easy lever here.
I particularly like the idea of the sponsorship from industry and work on problems. There's actually the Marketing Science Institute was started with that premise, where you had companies sponsoring an institute, which then farmed out projects to professors all over based on their expertise, and that's a nice matching process.
I mean, another sort of mechanism is maybe sort of building on. You mentioned George Stork, who I think is now sitting on the board of the SMS, and he was my mentor, actually. I'm very indebted to him. It's interesting that you chose to make George a fellow, because one can also suspend, I think, organizational boundaries by framing differently the criteria for affiliation. So in other words, if you reframed and you said, we regard as a credible academic strategist anyone independent of their organizational affiliation that is, translating theories for real world impact, agnostic of affiliation, you would probably say, well, a lot of people that work in investment banks do that. A lot of people that work in tech companies do that. Maybe some consultants do that. And that could be quite powerful, right? Sort of recognizing and affiliating with people without these sort of strict, academic versus practitioner distinctions, which are somewhat artificial in a way. I mean, I know many academics are extremely pragmatic, more pragmatic than practitioners, and I know some practitioners that are more theoretical and more conceptual than many academics, and so there's no necessary reason for these boundaries to be rigid. Imagine that the SMS was celebrating strategy. This probably is its aim, but imagine that in practice too, its purpose was to celebrate great strategy applied well, independent of where it comes from.
Thank you, Martin. We take good note of this.
So, Jeff, would you like to say literally a half sentence to thank our panelists?
Yes. Thank you so much, Martin, for spending all this time with us, and to our other panelists in our first of the SMS Fellows conversations. So, Ax, do you want to?
Yeah, I actually had a substantive comment as well, which is, the institutional incentives that you were talking about, Martin. There is change going on there as well, which is, actually quite positive and quite encouraging. And one of the changes is that AACSB which is the body that governs business schools, accredits them and so on, is looking for impact, is asking for impact, which is a big thing. And in our school, the College School of Management, the University of Minnesota, we've actually started looking at media mentions in terms of our evaluation process. So, change is taking place in the direction that you're suggesting. It's glacial. And who knows, when things will change enough, but certainly it is happening. So with that, I have the pleasant task of saying thank you so much for a most enlightening seminar. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Harveer. Thank you, Africa. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Anna Allen. And thank you, all the participants. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.